Hello, magandang magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Naririnig na ba ako?
Yes po, Director Ellen.
Jo?
Yes po, here po.
Okay, sige. Okay. Good morning, everyone, to our various colleagues from the various national government agencies. Magandang umaga po at isang makakalkasang umaga po sa ating lahat. Isang Happy Women's Month din. What I will provide here now is an overview of the Risk Resiliency Program as the Convergence Budgeting Program of the CCAM-DRR Cabinet Cluster and operating mechanism of the CCAM-DRR Roadmap. I will also discuss Program Convergence Budgeting and the related details about it as prescribed under the Department of Budget Management National Budget Memorandum. Next slide, please. What I will be broadly presenting for the portion is that I will mention about the DBM National Budget Memorandum Circular number 138, series of 2021, that is the National Budget Call for 2022, that likewise emphasizes on Program Convergence Budgeting as our as an intention to continually institutionalize it. Then I'd go into monitoring and assessment undertaken for 2019 to 2020. I'll mention a bit of the findings and recommendations from that study as it will relate to our 2022 enrollment of PAPs for PCB, and then to the PAPs that we will enroll for 2022, I will mention 4 key concerns that we hope can figure priority and figure prominently in the PAPs every agency RRR will enroll. And then go into guidelines to the preparation of RRP PCB for 2022 fiscal year, because we had given earlier deadlines and what will the timeline. Because there are about 38% or so for participants event, my first 8 slides will broadly introduce the RRP from some historical.
Hello po, Director Ellen. Hello po, Director Ellen. Ayan. Baka po nagkaroon lang po ng internet problem si Director Ellen. Requesting din po the help of our DENR Climate Change Service colleagues to assist po si Director.
Yeah. Jo, saan yung last ako narinig? Nawala ako, no? Party.
Andito po tayo, ma'am, dun sa may
outline. Okay. So I said that this will be the broad sequence of content that I will share, but that as there are about 38% of our participants now that are new to our gathering in comparison to last year's orientation, my first 8 slides will broadly introduce RRP from some historical context. But I would also like to additionally inform our participants here that if my staff has already done, we will include in the chat box today a link to an expanded discussion of the advisory on the preparation of RRP PCB for 2022 that we have issued last Monday to our various CCAM-DRR agencies, but of course they are officially always a standard operating procedure conveyed to your secretaries, to your undersecretaries, and to the focal persons that we deal with. But just in case, we are additionally including as items to be emailed to all of you by Joe and team, the expanded text on the advisory on preparation of RRP PCB for 2022. Because there are some details that I am constrained in sharing because of our limited time this morning. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in this executive order that is flashed to us, issued in 2017, the scope of the government's climate change and disaster response has been further defined and expanded across agencies with the issuance of this executive order number 24 issued in 2017. This expanded the cabinet cluster on what used to be just cabinet cluster on climate change adaptation and mitigation to what has been expanded to a CCAM-DRR cabinet cluster. And hence even memberships of departments had been expanded to the cluster. The creation of the cabinet cluster on CCAM-DRR pushed the national government's agenda on adaptation and resilience to deliver the national vision on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. These, particularly for the new ones, are shows to us the Cabinet Cluster Roadmap from 2018 that will close in 2022. The overall goal, again, is climate and disaster resilient communities supporting equitable and sustainable development. And our desired result by end of 2022 is that we would have enhanced these climate and disaster resilient communities. In this time, we've expanded to 24 vulnerable provinces and 4 major urban centers. And our major urban centers include Metro Manila, Metro Cebu, Metro Iloilo, Metro Davao. And in the next slide, we will show the vulnerable provinces. But this slide also tells us what are the 4 major outcome objectives of the roadmap. The first outcome is on increased adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities. Second outcome is on ensured adequate supply of clean air, water, and other natural resources. Third is increased resilience of critical infrastructure. Fourth is enhanced knowledge, access to information, and institutional capacities. And we hope that the PAPs that we will all be enrolling will be focused on this priority geographical focus of the roadmap, the climate vulnerable provinces, and the major urban centers. And also focusing on the outcome areas herein defined. Next slide, please. In the next slide, we just show here the geographical focus that we hope your PAPs could be enrolled to in terms of the climate and disaster vulnerabilities and needs of these priority provinces. Next slide, please. Again, we just want to emphasize that these provinces have been so chosen because of their high risk to climate hazards, they're being situated in critical watersheds, their high poverty incidence, and that they are convergence sites. Next slide, please. In order to operationalize the 4 outcomes of the CCAM-DRR roadmap, the cluster has adopted the Risk Resiliency Program as its convergence program. The Risk Resiliency Program seeks to aid the government in strengthening the resiliency of natural ecosystems and the adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities to short and long-term risks. More broadly, it is designed to strengthen climate change response in line with policies as contained in our Philippine Development Plan, our National Climate Change Action Plan, and even our disaster risk, the NDRIM plan. Next slide, please. As to objectives, the RRP objectives are included here. These seek to apply program convergence planning and budgeting to strengthen the country's actions to climate change adaptation, mitigation, disaster risk reduction. It seeks to help the government optimally use its available budget on priority CCAM-DRR programs, and it seeks to increase the size and quality of CCAM-DRR responsive investments. Next slide, please. And by way of some legal basis, this would enumerate that since 2013, the legal basis for RRP has already been enshrined with the National Budget Memorandum issued in 2013 until, of course, the latest would be the National Budget Memorandum issued in 2021, that is the National Budget Call for fiscal year 2022. This legal basis slide also tells us that in 2018, the Cabinet Cluster has adopted the roadmap, and in 2019, the Cabinet Cluster has likewise adopted the guidance document for RRP PCB. Next slide, please. And this slide just tells us the evolution from 2013 to 2019 and even to date, where we had mentioned about the adoption of the roadmap, the issuance of the EO, and even in 2018 and 2019 would signal our inclusion of local government units, particularly provincial governments, in the preparation of RRP through the regional development councils. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. There are 4 key investment areas under the RRP, and these are in community livelihood and enterprise continuity program, integrated water resources management program. Later, in fact, I will highlight on integrated water resources management program because we will all the more focus the expanded highlight we want to put into the integrated water resources management program cluster-wide. And then on enhancing coastal protection program, climate information services program, and a seismic resiliency program. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay. And these are the forms that are being filled up by our agencies in as you enroll RRP PCB programs. Next slide, please. Okay, even this would be the forms. I think you're all familiar with this. Next slide, please. Okay. 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 Next slide, please. Okay. So we mentioned here that we re-emphasize that National Budget Memorandum number 138, the National Budget Call for fiscal year 2022, institutionalizes program convergence budgeting strategy in the budget process to link, harmonize, and synchronize the timing of critical program interventions. And this mentions about the RRP, whereby being chair of the cluster, the DNR is the one endorsing to the DBM all PAPs that would be enrolled under the RRP, given the various considerations and criteria that we have. Next slide, please. Okay. In these few slides, I will just mention briefly that with technical assistance that the government has sought from World Bank, a study was commissioned to assess and monitor performance for RRP for the durations 2019 to 2020. And the broad assessments are giving us the following findings. One is in terms of generating CCAM-DRR investments for Tier 1 and Tier 2. For the observation has been such that 100% of all RRP tag PAPs for 2019 and 2020 are Tier 1 programs. And none of the RRP tag PAPs for 2019 and 2020 are Tier 2. And then in terms of the size, climate content, and alignment of provincial local government units with national government agency CCAM-DRR priorities, what had been the findings? As you would note, in 2020, the first time we are implementing focused programs to provincial governments in the first 8 provinces identified under the roadmap, we had come out with what we called investment portfolio for risk resilience for the priority provinces. And therefore, the IPRR of the PLGUs were compared with the agency RRP programs in the General Appropriations Act for 2020 and 2019. and results have indicated that they are either matched, undermatched, imperfectly matched, or overmatched. What are we saying here? We want to reemphasize to the agencies if there are IPRRs that had been developed and generated, also in consultation with the agencies and the provincial governments for our 8 provinces and even the next 6 provinces. We hope that the RRP PAPs that we will enroll for 2022 will keenly consider the climate and disaster vulnerabilities identified in the IPRR and even the programs that our provincial governments have proposed under the IPRR. We hope to see then that the IPRRs mentioned there would find some attention from the national government agencies and even with the regional government agency counterparts so that we could be seeing IPRR investment proposals being met. IPRR investment proposals from our provincial governments being met by PAPs being enrolled by our NGAs. Because the findings in such a study was such that there are unmet IPRR investment proposals from the provincial governments. We hope that we can reduce the unmet investment proposals of the provincial governments by national government agencies taking on proposals from the provincial governments that are priority focus of our RRP, PCB. There was also observation that there is no or lack of awareness of PAPs being implemented in the provincial government's jurisdiction. Because of our constraints, we had in the first year only piloted some of our CCAM-DRR agencies to see what are investment proposals of the provincial governments we can accommodate. Therefore, among our pilot agencies had been the DNR, the DPWH, the DA, and the DILG. And because we saw some PAPs enrolled that actually saw in the GAA of 2020, we also included our Department of Agrarian Reform there. But we hope that we could be expanding on even the NGAs that are including in their PAPs for enrollment to PCB and RRP beyond the 4 NGAs of the cluster that I mentioned. Our aim indeed is that cluster-wide, we can be having our NGAs increasingly enrolling PAPs that address the climate and disaster vulnerabilities that are included in the IPRRs of these provincial LGUs. Other findings of such a studies in terms of the contributions of the RRP PAPs to the CCAM-DRR outcomes, it was mentioned that there is scant information on baseline targets, periodic and cumulative accomplishment, variance and budget utilization rate across national government agencies. We want to align better and make more operable our monitoring and evaluation results framework across the national government agencies. By the way, we'd like to announce to our RRP agencies, CCAM-DRR members, that we have recently been out with hard copies of our operations manual on RRP PCB, and we will be distributing to all of our member agencies hard copies of our operations manual and the monitoring and evaluation framework. Even as earlier, of course, we had given electronic copies of these documents from us. And then in terms of climate science-based planning and prioritization of RRP PAPs, we hope that the risk relevance of PAPs and the uptake of climate information can be expanded so that there can be more climate science-based planning and prioritization of RRP PAPs to help us in development programming and to help our development programming be more evidence-based rather than political. Next slide, please. There had been other recommendations like to increase the size of RRP investments by optimizing fiscal spaces. There are also recommendations to institutionalize an annual joint review of IPRR between the provincial governments and the national government agencies to continually evaluate priorities and address the unmet needs as expressed in the provincial IPRRs. We also need to expand the engagement strategy by conducting intensive workshops with formal mechanisms for regularized coordination and feedback, and to sustain technical assistance being extended to our provincial governments coming from our NGAs and their regional counterparts also. Next slide, please. Other recommendations include the need to continuously update guidance documents to refine provisions as necessary. That is why we issued recently our advisory document for the preparation of RRP PCB for 2022. There was also recommendation that there's need to conduct regular orientation consultation meetings on the components of RRP to include the difficulties, successes, and status of projects to better inform the concerned NGAs and the provincial governments. And there was also recommendation made to formalize the structure of point persons or the RRP focal persons that we have in the different agencies or our CCAM-DRR focal point persons with specific terms of reference and special orders to further strengthen the basis of compliance with the RRP operations manual. Next slide, please. We also see even further recommendations made from the study to institutionalize a systematic transparency communication and feedback mechanism, to further streamline the results framework by more detailed tactic of what indicators are already being collected, by which data custodian or by which agency. Hopefully, the hard copies that we will distribute to the agencies will be an aid in this direction. And it was also recommended that we need to initiate discussions on endorsing the process that we have in our Risk Resiliency Program as a strategy for national government agency technical assistance and supervision to provincial governments in the utilization of the Mandana's ruling funds for CCAM-DRR Cabinet Cluster. Next slide, please. Okay. So in my next slides, I will point out now in the preparation of PAPs for RRP PCB for fiscal year 2022, we have enumerated 4 focus areas that we hope can be the priority source even of PAPs concerns that will be enrolled by the agencies. And when I say 4, I mention now the priorities and strategies identified in IATF in the We Recover as One report of NEDA to be responsive to our pandemic and the health crisis that we are in now with COVID-19. And a second strategy and a second focus that we want to emphasize here is more than doing geographic focus to our enrollment of PAPs, we also want to highlight in this 2022 enrollment of PAPs an expanded focus, a highlight towards a water secure and resilient Philippines initiative that we hope can cut across all of our CCAM-DRR agencies. And then third, as a source of our priority focus of PAPs to be enrolled, we like to inform and remind the body that there is an Executive Order number 120 that has been issued in November 2020 that has created the task force Build Back Better. Many of our CCAM-DRR agencies are also members to this task force, and therefore, as another source of major focus of PAPs to enroll, we would like to remind our member agencies to be reminded of the priorities for Cagayan Valley, Marikina River Basin, and Bicol River Basin that are part of the implementation plans of the task force Build Back Better. We hope they can also figure and be not forgotten in the PAPs to be enrolled for 2022 by the respective agencies. And finally, there is a policy brief on Greening Philippines COVID-19 Response and Recovery Program. This is also related to the item A on IATF priorities and strategies. The DNR has been with the technical assistance with the United Nations Development Program for Greening the Philippines COVID-19 Response and Recovery Program. We are annexing then to this presentation and even to the expanded advisory document that you will be issued after this presentation in terms of a policy brief on greening the Philippines COVID-19 Response and Recovery Program. We also hope that that will be a fourth source of major focus of the PAPs that you will enroll, that agencies will enroll for 2022. And then I go into some other details of the guidelines in the preparation of the PCB PAPs for 2022 and end with the timeline. And therefore, uh, as I uh, as I dwell on the need for water security being top of the agenda, during our previous years, water and disaster preparedness sector received few to very scanty investments. According to the Asian Water Development Outlook 2020, recovering from the setback caused by COVID-19 and adapting to climate change require countries to put water security at the top of their agenda. Pursuing water security measures will not only enable economic growth, but also provide the conditions for a healthy and prosperous population. Next slide, please. Uh, serving as our guide, we mentioned earlier the key findings and recommendations of the performance monitoring assessment that of RRP that can provide us the opportunity to expand and refocus our investments and address these issues and concerns. Next slide, please. And now, to what will be the four main, to what we are urging to be the main source of focus for the PAPs to be enrolled. First in this list would be the IATF strategies and priorities, where we are reminded of uh, the need to address the primary concerns of CCAM-DRR cluster under the new normal in these areas, ensuring water security in the COVID-19 pandemic affected areas, streamlining the management of healthcare and infectious waste, especially at the community level, prioritizing the protection and conservation of natural resources, especially in degraded hotspots and critical ecosystems to also prevent a future pandemic. Next slide, please. In the Philippines, efficient water resource management is another area where underinvestment has been observed. There is currently about a 32% gap between water demand and supply across the 18 river basins. Under a high climate scenario, this is expected to increase to 54% if no actions are taken for adaptation in the water resources sector. To reduce the water gap below 32%, an increase in water resources investments shall be pursued. And therefore, the cluster has to expand its concerns, areas of concern that would address water security and resilience in the country. Potential identified convergence efforts are in the areas of promoting water as a sustainable resource, improving water sector governance and sustainable management of surface water and groundwater resources, addressing the linkages from the water source to coastal areas, resulting in economic growth opportunities, restoring ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, and improving livelihoods. Next slide, please. Serving as our guide, the Asian Development Bank has developed a program framework with the following key interdependent key dimensions, or KD, to quantify water security in Asia and the Pacific. And we see on the screen now, key dimension 1 talks about rural household water security or access to water supply, access to sanitation and health impacts affordability. Key dimension 2 is economic water security, broad economic agriculture, energy and industry. Therefore, our in terms of DA, in terms of DOE, in terms of DTI, this would be tackled. In key dimension 3, urban water security, where our MMDA as our member, as our cabinet cluster member is part of, DILG, in our other DOH2, we talk here of access to water supply, access to sanitation, affordability, drainage, flooding, and water quality with the DNR and in its concerns are key concerns to look at and to work for. Next slide, please. Would be our other key dimensions on environmental water security, and this will involve catchment and aquatic system condition index and environmental governance index. And then our key dimension 5 would talk about water-related disaster security, climate risk, drought, hydrological risk, flood, and meteorological risk, where our DOST, our OCD, our DPWH, our DILG, and other member agencies' concerns would be tackled. Next slide, please. And now I go to a third major source of focus for the PAPs that we will enroll. We hope that again, there are member agencies within the task force that are likewise member agencies to our CCAM-DRR Cabinet Cluster. There are 6 key result areas under the task force Build Back Better. And our priority focus here are the 3 river basins that had been so distraught, so devastated by typhoons Rolly and Ulysses in late 2020. The key result area 1 is on better and resilient infrastructure, and this is headed by DPWH. Our key result area 2 is on stronger, shelter, and resilient settlement, and this is headed by our Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development with HADSI, that is likewise a CCAM-DRR cluster member. Our key result area 3 is headed by OCD DND on improved systems and essential service. Our key result area 4 is in restored sustainable livelihood, led by the DTI. Our key result area 5 of the Task Force Build Back Better is on strengthened governance through broad-based citizen input, and this is led by DILG. And our final key result area 6 is on intensified watershed management, and this is led by the DENR. We then would like to remind the agencies that there are areas in their agencies that are part of the implementation plans for 2022 that should not be forgotten in the PAPs to be enrolled for RRP PCB for 2022. Next, we talk here of a final source of focus areas that could be included in the PAPs to be enrolled for 2022. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is closely related to the IATF priorities and strategies. The policy brief on greening the Philippines COVID-19 response and recovery presents the urgent policy issues and concerns relating to COVID-19 pandemic and climate change that need to be addressed at the program level. This also provides the necessary actions to be undertaken by government agencies in the immediate, medium, and long term to amplify response, recovery, and resilience programs to address the impacts of both COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. We see on the screen concerns for health protection and care program for COVID-19 with our DOH as our member in the cluster and the DNR. These are concerns to them with DOST also. We talk of the need for alternative livelihood support program, product value added program, disaster emergency response program. Therefore, OCD, DND, DOST would figure, and DILG would figure here. Resilient Evacuation Center Program would be concerns of our DPWH, Disaster Management Program, CCAM-DRR Support Program, Research Program on Viral Transmission and Climate Change Impacts with DOST, and even with our research sector of the DNR. Our Legislative Reform Program, a Low Carbon Support Program, Green and Gray Infrastructure Support Program are some of those highlighted in the policy briefs for greening the Philippines COVID-19 response to the COVID program. Okay, next slide, please. So having emphasized now the 4 major sources of focus for PAPs to be enrolled for 2022, I now list down guidelines on the preparation of RRP PCB for 2022. We hope then that our respective member agencies can align the proposed PAPs again with IATF strategies priorities here, the Water Secure and Resilient Philippines proposal, greening the Philippines COVID-19 response, and the Task Force Build Back Better priorities with the agency's mandates and PREXI, our program expenditure classification. Next slide, please. And then We hope that the various agencies can identify which among those have potential PAPs, which among the potential PAPs can be enrolled under the agency's existing PAPs. So we remind our agencies again that there are provincial investment portfolio for risk resilience for the 8 provinces, for the 6 provinces, together for already for the 14 provinces, even as we have lined up for 24 priority critical provinces. And we hope that our agencies can be reminded of those in the IPRRs as you consider enrolling PAPs from the agencies. We also want to remind you of the key findings and recommendations in the RRP Performance Monitoring and Assessment and the 4 sources of major concerns for the PAPs to be enrolled. IATF priorities towards a water secure and resilient Philippines, key programs of the Task Force Build Back Better, and the policy brief on greening Philippines COVID-19 response and recovery program. Next slide, please. The forms I have earlier flashed are PCB Form number 1 and BP Form 202A. The agencies will need to accomplish them, and they'll have to be duly signed. When this will undertake technical review committee review meetings, our final forms will not be honored by the DBM if they are not duly signed by the officials mentioned in the forms. No? So this is one delaying factor that we hope we can avoid this time. Last year when we were doing the consolidation, a number of the forms from the agencies will have not been honored by the DBM because they have not been duly signed by the concerned officials. Also as included in terms of rank in the forms. Then fourth, we will have to submit to the DNR, being the RRP Secretariat, the duly signed PCB Form number 1 and BP 202A. The submission will include a list of PAPs enrolled for inclusion in the RRP. The submission may already be an existing PAP for expansion or redesign as part of Tier 1, or a new PAP that is a Tier 2 proposal, aligned with the components identified in each of the investments. For Tier 2 PAPs, we would like to remind the agencies that there is also need to submit additional requirements being required by the DBM for new PAPs together with the accomplished PCB forms. Even these requirements from the DBM, we have listed down in the PCB forms. This was another area of delay in the past. We have to remind the agencies to have higher chance of being finally considered. The Tier 2 PAPs will also need to comply with the additional requirements set forth by the DBM. Next slide, please. Then the DNR will convene an RRP Technical Review Committee to review the draft PCB forms and the BP 202A form, including the consistency and appropriateness of the PAPs in terms of the outcome and overall goal with the CCAM-DRR Roadmap. The TRC is a smaller number from the Cabinet Cluster member agencies, comprising of some of the selected oversight agencies and some of the key member agencies of the cluster. The Technical Review Committee, with a date to be flashed in the next slide in terms of timeline, will be convened and will submit its findings and recommendations to the DNR. Any recommendations or findings shall then be communicated by the DNR as Secretariat to the concerned participating agencies and even the provinces. And then if there are areas to revise, the concerned agencies will have to resubmit to the DNR their revised PCB Form number 1 and BP Form 202A to address the comments, if any, that would arise from the Technical Review Committee or the TRC. Next slide, please. The DNR then will revise the form, present the proposed PAPs to a Cabinet Cluster meeting for endorsement through a Cabinet Cluster Resolution. Number 9 step will be, after all of these processes are done, the DNR will officially transmit to the DBM the submission of PAPs composed of an RRP narrative with the corresponding forms as filled up by the agencies. And then you will have to observe the timeline for the review and submission of the RRP PCP proposals for 2022. Next slide, please. The timelines are for 2022 submission. Already some agencies have submitted some of their PCB forms. In fact, after this, I will give an update of what submissions we got. But because of the emphasis of the highlight in terms of the 4 sources of focus for our PAPs enrollment, we have given an extended deadline up to March 17 for any revisions, enhancements, or additions to the PAPs to be enrolled by the respective agencies. After this, we are setting a technical review committee meeting by about 2 weeks after submission. This will be for April 7. We are setting that this will be presented to a CCAM-DRR Cabinet Cluster meeting, and we will be requesting a meeting to happen in April 21 so that these PAPs to be enrolled can be presented to the cluster. And then we're expecting submission to the DBM by about May 5. Next slide, please. So in terms of updates of already because we had given earlier deadline, in fact, our first deadline was submission to us last February 15. We are summarizing now the updates of the submissions we got so far. We had gotten submissions from, this had been the over the years, the experience that we would have, no? So over the years, we would have increasing the numbers, amounts, broadly, generally increasing over the years, with DPWH topping our list because of the high budgeted infrastructure projects. So this would be what you would be seeing. Next slide, please. From 2019 actual and the 2020 GAA and 2021 GAA, this would be the other numbers we would be headed. Next slide, please. And in terms of a line graph, over the years, this is what we were experiencing. The blue one there would be the DPWH amounts. So over the years, either they will be increasing or a plateau with very few on the decline. Next slide, please. Already, we had gotten submissions from 7 out of 15 agencies that we expect to be submitting PAPs to us. So we're still awaiting submissions from 8 of our CCAM-DRR agencies. Although to the 7, we would hope that we could still receive enhanced and expanded or even revised PAPs enrollment based on the discussions we had. To date, we had gotten PAPs proposals for 98 in number and a total proposed programs for 280 billion. Next slide, please. To date, this is what we got in terms of Tier 1 proposals, Tier 2 proposals, and total PAPs from the 7 agencies so far. And the different bureaus of the different offices of the DENR also included there. And over the years, this is what we had been getting in terms of total cost and in terms of PI, in terms of per agency. Okay, so we're getting a high percentage from the DOTR. We have not yet gotten submission from the DPWH, and therefore we could not yet see them in this pie chart. Additionally, DPWH would also be figuring in the big portions of the pie. Next slide, please. In terms of outcomes, I mentioned earlier the 4 outcomes of the CCAM-DRR Roadmap, and these had been the submissions that we that we had received so far. I saw on the chat box that the DSWD has requested assistance from us. Yes, we have noted that, and we'll just look forward to having the date from you, a decision of common date to be able to assist you in your proposals. Okay, next slide, please. So again, may I just remind that these are the timelines that we would like to observe for our submissions to be aligned with the DBM requirements. Do we have a DBM member in our midst?
Yes po, ma'am. We have representation
If
here.
if we have a DBM member in our midst, are there changes in the deadlines from the DBM? Are our dates here going to be in line with the timelines of DBM? Okay, so we'd like to remind our agencies of these deadlines and these timelines to be able for us to hope to have higher fiscal space within the DBM's fiscal spaces. Joy, are our timelines in accordance or
Good morning.
noting to the timelines of DBM? Yes.
Good morning po. As of the moment, we are we are still following the budget calendar in the national budget call po. So we will advise our agencies, our counterpart agencies once na magkaroon po ng adjustments dun sa timeline. Pero as of now po, we are still following that calendar po.
Okay,
Thank you.
and given that calendar, these dates are in order and aligned to that calendar. These are targets though, no? There could be plus and plus in terms of delay. But we hope that with the cooperation of the agencies, if we can be observing this to allow us for, some adjustments along the way. Okay, so I think with that, we would like to continue to urge continuous cooperation from our agencies to be able to target an increasing slice in the fiscal space within the DBM so that we may be able to address the emergency that we are in now, the health emergency that we are in with the pandemic, and the climate crisis emergency that we are in. Yun lamang po, maraming salamat.